Good afternoon. For my Channel 7 family, if you don't think it's pressure, try coming behind a distinguished rabbi and a former governor and former U.S. ambassador to Canada. And after such eloquent tributes in my United Methodist tradition, I guess the only thing to say is amen and maybe sit down. But I'll try to do in the Liz Taylor tradition, as she told her seventh husband. I'll try to be up here long enough to make it interesting, but short enough to make it respectable. Today we memorialize Jim Herrington as a way to pay tribute to his many, many contributions to journalism and our society as a whole. It's also a way to say, thank you, Jim. Thank you for running not a sprint, but a marathon. You didn't just see Jim come in quickly in this profession and shot in the dark. He was here for decades. And he did an outstanding job that entire time. Simply put, I think those of us who are journalists would just say Jim Herrington was a reporter's reporter. Governor Blanchard mentioned Walter Cronkite. I wouldn't disagree with that one iota. But he was also a mix between David Brinkley and a Charles Kuralt. His coverage of the 1967 riots or rebellion, whichever term you feel most comfortable with, was outstanding. It was insightful. It was sensitive. It was courageous. His documentaries on politics and education were award-winning. His feature stories were up close, they were emotional, they were humorous, and they were personal. And whether he was on the street covering a story or in studio hosting Spotlight on the News, the Pennsylvania native and Northwestern University grad had a relaxed, conversational style. Jim would be interviewing you, and you would be eliciting information, not really realizing that he was getting everything he wanted out of you, because he just sort of relaxed you. Jim did it all, and he did it all very well. His greatest love, as Governor Blanchard said, was covering politics. And no place showcased that better than when he took over the reins of Spotlight. Many of you know Spotlight began way back in 1965, long before I got to Detroit. The news director at that time was Bill Fife. It is today Michigan's longest running weekly news and public affairs program. Jim hosted it for 20 years, to date the longest serving host. Early panelists included Bill Bonds, Barney Morris, Bob Maher, and others. What I remember most about watching Jim through those years is Jim knew how to ask a question. He knew the tone in which to ask the question. Most importantly, and this is real important, particularly because of what we see on television today, Jim knew how to listen. And in listening, he oftentimes would find that one little thing that that person had just said that he could turn right around and bring out the real truth in that interview. He also knew how to play traffic cop. He oftentimes flanked himself with other journalists. Jim never felt as though he had to compete with the other guests on the set, whether it was the newsmaker or it was his fellow journalists. He always was mindful of the fact that the spotlight should be on them. Now he knew when to step in when something was going on too long, or when it needed redirecting, or when he needed to sort of take it over. But it wasn't a habit that he formed. He was confident in his abilities, but he was humble in his on-air and off-air presentation. Jim was a mentor. He was a teacher. He didn't do it by telling you, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. You learned by example, by just watching him. Here's what some others said in 1993 when we had a retirement party at the station for Jim. Bill Bond said, quote, "No reporter ever had more respect for his profession. No reporter ever had more respect for the truth. No reporter ever worked harder at getting the who, what, where, when, and why of a story and then reporting it objectively than Jim Herrington." Al Upchurch, who now is a public relations executive, one time worked very closely with Jim, his producer and his news director. He said, "Perspective is what you brought to our news every day." Tom Polk, who longtime creative services person at our station, said, "Describing your philosophy of news coverage in a 1989 station promo, you said, quote, objective is the word we like to use, but honest is what it really means." Bob Kaczynski, who always has a funny line when you walk through the newsroom, he said, "You know, you always felt kind of dumb around Jim." He said, because he was so intelligent. And then African-American historian Paul Lee, who I think is in the audience here today, I saw him earlier, sent me an email a few days ago. And in talking about Jim's unique relationship, particularly in the 60s and 70s when things were very tense with race relations, not just in Detroit, but all across this country, and his going in and out of Detroit covering the various leaders, Paul said, Jim was unique and rare, and why he was trusted, respected, and even treasured by us, meaning African Americans, was because Jim Herrington saw our color and recognized his own, but he was more concerned with the humanity underneath both. Now, the editors at the station might have had a slightly different point of view of Jim, because Jim in his conversational style had a way of always stepping in when it was time for them to make an audio edit. He was famous when that person was talking and all of a sudden he said, yeah, right, right. And it was always a point when they wanted a nice, clean edit. But that was Jim's style. So you would hear some interesting words come out of the edit booth trying to edit Jim. But most of all, what you heard people say about Jim Herrington is that he was trusted. He was competent. As Jim Blanchard said, he was a family man. I remember one of his last negotiations, and he came out of the room with, I think, Grace and Tom Greensdorf. He said, "Well, Chuck, I just finished my last negotiation." I said, "Well, how did it go, Jim?" And he said, "Got more vacation time." I said, "More vacation time?" He said, "Chuck, at this stage of my life, that's what's important. More time for family, more time for travel." He said, "We don't talk about money, it's about vacation time." And I think Jim won that one. He was a world traveler. He absolutely loved, after coming back on his many vacations, come in and have a photo album. And he would show you all the pictures, and he'd show it to the guests, and he'd give you the full history of where he had been and what a great time he and Carol and other family members have had. And of course, Jim was a great gardener. We had the Channel 7 garden, and Grace got that plowed up, and Jim would go there after work, and he'd come in, and he'd do it on spotlight nights too, and he'd come in, and he'd have to wash his fingers real quick before he ran into the set to get all the dirt out from under his nails, and then he would share what he had grown with the staff. And to all of our WXYZ alumni, they don't want us to forget the many contributions, nor do they want us to rest on their laurels. They built the journalistic foundation those of us at the station today enjoy. But they built it with the understanding that it was just a relay site and not a resting post. The last thing Jim said to me and to our viewing audience on Election Day 2012 was not about himself. It was about journalism. And as Jim, in his own way, very simply said, and we were doing a telephone interview with him on our WXYZ.com, he just said, quote, "Chuck, keep Spotlight going. And with hard work and a little luck, I hope we can say 2 years from now, the Spotlight turns 50. Jim, it's still going. And thank you for getting us off to such a strong, strong start." Thank you. Jim, rest in peace. Exactly.